I'm really looking forward to talking to this next guest. He's been on the program before, and he's written a book that I am happily reading at the moment. He is covering a topic that I feel very positive about. And in this day and age, when people on the left are constantly dealing with bad news, it's great to have something that definitely consists of a lot of good news. So first of all, I'll introduce the guest, Eric Blanc. He is a former teacher, high school teacher in the Bay Area. He is a journalist, and he is most recently the author of the book Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. He's been covering that story for a while. We've had him on to talk about it. Now he's got his book out, and he joins us now. So first of all, Eric, welcome back to the program.
Great. It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. And let's start with this. The book came out recently. How's the reception to it been?
Oh, it's been great. We actually already are on a second printing, so that as a metric is helpful. And generally, I've been on tour already for a few weeks talking about the strikes and the book. And as mentioned, I think people are really looking for a ray of hope. So talking about working people fighting back and that spreading, it's not something that you normally get. So I think part of the positive reception is a reflection of that dynamic.
Well, that's great to hear, and I'm glad that you're able to provide that service, and I'm serious about that, of giving people some hope. And one of the hope comes for me in multiple dimensions. One is obviously a successful labor action, a relatively spontaneously organized labor action, although you point out that there were dedicated teacher organizers involved in making this happen. And also, as implicit in the title of your book, Red State Revolt, the fact that this happened in what are traditionally thought of red states, the fact that it did happen this way, and your reporting confirms this for me, it conforms to a belief I've had for a long time, which is that I think that a lot of people, particularly many Democrats, members of the Democratic Party, think of the residents of red states in overly simplistic terms. And what we have here is a genuine labor action arising from the residents of these primarily red states where it occurred, with a lot of support from the general population and even from their own students, right?
Yeah, I mean, the big story of these strikes in some ways is that it punctures the myth that the United States is fundamentally divided between red states and blue states. The narrative that everyone is polarized between liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans really underestimates the extent to which the biggest political division, I would argue, is not left or right, but bottom and up, which is to say social class, and that there really is an unexpressed majoritarian sentiment already for working class politics. It's just that neither of the two parties gives voice to that. And so when you have something like a strike in a red state, it can seem like it came out of nowhere. But in fact, it really gave expression to what the sentiments of large numbers of working class people in these states were. In West Virginia, for instance, you had every single county voted for Trump in the election, but every single county had as well voted for Bernie in the primary. So you get a sense that really politics as usual has for a long time now been discredited, and people are looking for alternatives.
And you also, and I love that comment. It's very timely for us because we're doing an exploration on this show of the concept of class, and including talking with the economist Richard Wolff about it. And I think what it shows is that we've had 30 years or more of a kind of political narrative in this country that says you can divide people up in the ways you just described, or you can divide them up as evangelicals and secular, or you can divide them up as professionals versus non-professionals, or you have the apotheosis of that whole thinking with Mark Penn, the Democratic pollster, who would talk about soccer moms and all this and that. But the simple division of working people and then people who don't work, and the conflict between those two sets of interests get overlooked. And it seems to me that the strikes that you covered were, among other things, an uprising of working people against those who don't respect or reflect their interests.
Yeah, that's 100% accurate. And in some ways, the fact that these were public sector strikes might make it seem like the conflict was just between workers and the government. But in reality, the reason that there's not funding for schools, the reason that there's teacher shortages because teachers aren't getting paid well, is overwhelmingly because these large corporations in every single one of these states have bled the state coffers dry through imposing upon the politicians that they pay for austerity, tax cuts in particular. And so the strikes themselves, even if at first they were framed just on the question of public education, became inevitably in every single one of the cases a conflict against the big businesses that aren't paying their fair share in taxes. And so in West Virginia, it was the out-of-state natural gas corporations, the oil corporations in Oklahoma, big corporations in Arizona. In every single one of these cases, workers said that in order for the government to give us what we need and what our students need, the rich are going to have to pay. So really, that conflict between capitalists and workers was very much part of the story.
And what's fascinating to me about that, Eric Blanc, is that as you talk about in your book, and you talked about before that in your reporting for Jacobin magazine, they were able, first of all, to expand it from a simple, as you say, employee-employer dispute to something broader about education as a public good, about inequality and the role of corporations and versus working people and all that. But they did so with a pretty good amount of support from the public who, for example, in states where the public might be highly disinclined, for example, to describe itself as socialist, for example, but yet they got, I felt to a large extent, it wasn't, universal support, I guess, but I felt to a large extent, many people understood that these teachers were striking for them and for the interests of people like them and continued to support them as the strikes wore on. But is my impression correct or not correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is more or less indisputable that the strikes were overwhelmingly supported by the population. I mean, the polls in Oklahoma, for instance, the poll at the end of the strike showed that 75% of the population supported the strike. There's been national polls of what percentage of people have supported the teacher strikes, upwards of 70%. And the same in West Virginia and Arizona. And you saw that in not just the polls, but in just these massive actions that weren't just actions of the teachers and the school workers that struck, but of students who organized their own walkouts, of parents who came out with coffee and donuts to support their teachers. And that in turn reflected the fact that these teachers who initiated the walkouts, as you mentioned, weren't fighting just for better pay, but were fighting on behalf of working people as a whole. In West Virginia, the strike was actually for better pay and better health care for all public employees. In the other states, it was for better funding and against privatization that would have hurt students, and that the underfunding that has already hurt students. So parents saw that. Parents saw that these teachers weren't being greedy, contrary to what the Republican legislators were saying, and they responded very positively, overwhelmingly.
And some of the teachers themselves in your book describe, let me back up a second. I've long felt that one of the great things that activism, that movement politics, that mass movement politics does for human beings, particularly when they see their lives and their worlds crumbling around them, a situation that often leads to what's been called the deaths of despair, of suicide, alcoholism, opioid addiction, and so on. That one of the things that people under duress most benefit from in movement activism is it gives life meaning and purpose and gives people something to live for. I love the quote in your book. I'm reading it now. One of the Arizona educators who said, quote, "Rallying at the Capitol was one of the few moments in my lifetime where I felt I stood exactly where one ought to. It was unequivocally purposeful, courageous and joyful. I love that quote. And did you see a lot of that, of people finding meaning in this work?
Yeah, I mean, the story of the strike really, for so many people, and what I tried to describe in the book, was transformative. It was not just about education, and it stopped even just being political conflict. And people were transformed in their relationships with other people at their work and other people in the community. And for most of the time, in most periods, working people are resigned to just accepting things, right? You don't have power. And so you are basically forced to just try to get by as an individual. And what these strikes did is it gave people a sense of collective and individual agency, where there was almost a euphoric quality where people felt that their lives had meaning. They felt like they had connections to others. That alienation that on the day-to-day really defines a lot of our experiences broke down, because you're spending all day at a Capitol building with 10,000 strangers. And the phrase that kept on getting brought up was, well, I have 10,000 new friends now, right? Where people would feed you, people would, have your back. People would give you a ride back for 4 hours to whatever your hometown was, even if they'd never met you. They would house strangers who were teachers on strike. There's all of this kind of outpouring of solidarity that gives you kind of a glimpse of how society could or should be, but it's not.
And, again, we're talking with Eric Blanc, who's the author of the book Red State Revolt. You're not going to get that on the internet. This is one of those things where movement activism in physical space, to me, is a big deal. And we saw a lot of that in this teachers' strike. One of the interesting aspects of your reporting on it, for me, Eric, was that, I have a sort of anarchist streak in my personality, and I like to think that people can spontaneously form themselves into groups. I'm trying to remember the famous quote about a strong movement doesn't need strong leaders. But you write that the strike movements were not completely leaderless nor completely spontaneous, and that there were specific, specific political perspectives and tactical choices of a dedicated core of militant teachers that most decisively shaped these strikes' dynamics and outcomes. So what kind of people were these teachers, and what kind of work did they do?
Yeah, the interesting thing that came clear to me in the research, and then also just in witnessing and being on the ground in these strikes, was that a lot of the young rank and file teachers that really initiated the walkouts, because they weren't initiated by the unions sort of came on board afterwards. These were in large part socialists, radicals, who had gotten first politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign. So in West Virginia, the first organizing that really set the ball in motion for the walkout came with a study group of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, in 2017 around a book study of Jane McAlevy's work, No Shortcuts. And in Arizona, the strike leaders were Bernie-crats who had first gotten politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign. One of them, Dylan Wagela, his first political organizing effort ever had been organizing a keg party to raise funds for Bernie Sanders. So it was these kind of younger radicals who had a sense of class conflict, who had a sense that the traditional reliance of the labor movement on Democratic Party politicians wasn't working. They really drove forward the actions. And, it's a very inspiring historic phenomena that hopefully the kind of traditions of radicalism, which were broken from the labor movement by the Red Scare, are, for the first time in a long time, getting reunited.
And you wrote, the Red State Rebellions have demonstrated that reuniting political radicalism and organized labor is both necessary and possible. So maybe in the minute or two we have left, where do you see that going? Did people, for example, in these Red State strikes, did they know they were consorting with political radicals? Did they feel okay about it? Is it something people were able to come out about and work with them openly about? And did you see a path to future collaborations coming out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really remarkable because these were red states in which, even saying you're a Democrat is sometimes beyond the pale. And it definitely became a thing because the Republican media and politicians made it a thing. There was a lot of red baiting, particularly in Arizona, in which it was front page news that the leaders of Red for Ed were socialists. The top Republican legislators had op-ed after op-ed denouncing the socialist inclinations of the leaders. But the amazing thing is the rank and file educators didn't bolt. They didn't freak out. They said, well, if the Republicans are against this, maybe it's not as bad as I thought, because they had gone through this very deep experience of politicians lying about everything, whether it came to the strike or anything. So really the level of legitimacy of the people making these attacks was lost. And in that sense, really the red baiting was ultimately counterproductive, because I read through all of these Facebook groups in which all of a sudden there's a discussion of what is socialism? What is it, just public schools? Oh, maybe we're all socialists because we support public schools. There was this really kind of interesting debate that would not have happened otherwise if it hadn't really been for these attacks on socialists. But overwhelmingly, people, didn't all become socialists, but they accepted that some of their key organizers and leaders were, and that's fine. It's a legitimate current of political thought now in the United States, and it's very exciting that it's sort of back in at least mainstream for discussion.
Well, and I do have to say in closing, it was also very exciting for your dog, because when you mentioned the DSA earlier, he or she started barking quite a bit. So I think you have a good DSA dog in the house there. But it is very exciting. And as you point out in the book, that relationship between socialist politics, left politics, and the labor movement has been a very fertile one over the years in American history, and there's a good chance, based on the evidence, that it may be again. So any brief thought in closing before I let you go?
Yeah, it's an amazing moment we're in right now, where you have the growth of a socialist movement through the DSA, you have a teachers' strike wave, and you have the possibility of electing a democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders, to president of the United States. So, moments like this don't happen very often, so it's important, I think, that we seize them fully.
Okay, well, I can't agree with you more. So Eric Blanc, author of the book Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet.